Get this camera on.
Did you get your Black Friday deals for your cat?
No, I'm a
Dang it.
horrible father.
No, I need to buy something for you. It's like Christmas is coming up. I ought to get something for you. Yeah, no, your cat's like that's like a protest. It's like where is my Black Friday deals or different things. Yeah, it's amazing when this happens. You're like, well, maybe I ought to just buy something because it's Black Friday. And I was up and I was like, no, no, I am not doing that. No, no. So you had an amazing talk with Michelle on the philosophy of timing the other night. I have not had a chance to listen to all of it, but I also love what you're doing on Caputo in the event. And it's interesting because I felt like it overlapped a little bit. I've been thinking about in return to a book I read years ago that was actually a big deal. And it's funny how you have these books that are a big deal and you forget about it. It's called The Freedom of Self-Forgetfulness by Timothy Keller. And what this book is trying to argue is that, you got the categories of selfish and selfless, and how you kind of both of them are a problem. Obviously, if you're selfish, you're bad. But then there's a kind of selflessness that's always like focused on why you're a failure and how you're not being selfish, but you're actually still ego obsessed. And he introduces the third category of kind of self-forgetfulness, which is where you just use yourself like you use a thumb, really. Like you don't think about your
Mm,
thumb, nor do you make a point to cut off your thumb. You just use it, right? But if you
yeah.
think about your thumb, there's a kind of deformity that comes with that. And so, like, self forgetfulness is kind of the ideal where you just don't think about yourself, you just use yourself. And it's kind of interesting because it made me think about how, with timing, if you're so focused on when you step in or when you don't step in, you like miss your timing. It's actually really important to engage in a kind of self forgetfulness. In the same way, I always think about when I read that book, I was talking with Bernard about the hip hop cipher. And when you're doing like freestyle hip hop, if you think too hard about what you're going to say next, you can't think of anything and you lose it. You have to forget yourself and just go. And that's how you do the timing well. And it also kind of makes me think, and I'll give it to you. Michelle was talking when we were driving because, yesterday was Thanksgiving and I hear you're supposed to like be social on those events, right? So we were driving up to her family's house and she was talking about how in Caputo, and this is very good. I read Caputo like a decade ago and I remember him liking him very much. And he's got this kind of idea that you're supposed to be prepared for the unexpected, like the arrival of the event open to possibility. But how do you be open to something that you don't know is going to occur? How do you be prepared for something you don't know is going to happen? And to me, there's something about self-forgetfulness that is that, where you're just like so capable, you're not thinking about are you prepared, you're just able to step into it. So I was thinking about those things together. It's interesting because I actually think the topic of like self-forgetfulness has a lot to do with actually topics like, the artist, the great writer forgets they're a writer, they just write. But it's kind of, I actually sometimes think it applies to gender as well. Like the man who's always thinking, am I a man, as opposed to just forgetting about it, is actually insecure, right? And how a
Mhm.
lot of the gender problem today, because I was thinking about this topic, it's almost like it's a result in a funny way of thinking too much about gender, which
Mhm.
in a way, the efforts of like a Judith Butler and all that to deconstruct gender, in a way, is the goal to like get rid of gender. But there's a difference between getting rid of gender through deconstructing it, which seems pathological or an effacement, as opposed to a kind of gender forgetfulness, where you're just capable of participating in your gender without thinking about it. So it's negated and then sublimated into this state of just kind of always preparedness. So I've been thinking about that, and it makes me think of your work on timing and so on and so on.
Yeah, like I haven't like completely, I mean, there's a lot of work to be done with Caputo,
Sure.
but my first instinct with Caputo, just kind of like briefly getting introduced to his ideas, I feel like, and I think you nailed something very important that I kind of noticed too with Caputo, is that just to kind of use Derrida against him
Mm,
in a kind of funny fashion, is that I feel like Caputo only addresses the discourse of the event, if
mm,
that makes any sense.
sure. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
There is no discourse on the subject. And I
Yes.
feel like that's actually what's missing with
Yes.
Caputo because he keeps talking about the event, how we should
Yes.
respond to the event, but in my opinion, that's simply a discourse of the event.
Yes.
And that's why I really felt like when I was talking about the term when or the nature of when, is that yeah, you're right. Like we can never actually know when.
Yeah.
And it does melt into Caputo. However, I think the nature of when is on the discourse of the subject. mainly because we can always use that material, the leftover material of when, whether it be sort of our memories of past decisions or anything like that, to sort of creatively respond to the event or what we think is the event, or so on. You know, it's something that we think that is, but we cannot really determine what it is. So I think the nature of when, and I think your the art of self-forgetfulness. I've been coming up with a term because Caputo likes talking about theopoetics a lot.
Yeah. I remember that. Yeah, right.
Yeah. But I started coming up with the term, and I will quote it here as officially, chronopoesis.
Mm.
Um,
Oh,
and
nice. Yeah.
making time, time making.
Mm.
This what I call this is sort of like we need to have a better relationship with time rather than trying to define what time is through some type of philosophy of time. I
Right.
actually think constructing some type of philosophy of time is actually an aspect of chronopoesis itself,
Mm.
actually,
Mm.
right? Because if you think about it, why is it that now we feel the demand to come up with a new philosophy of time,
Mm.
right? And that already, to me, indicates we have some type of relationship with time, some type of relationship that is already demanding, that we feel the necessity to respond and create even a new philosophy of time or a new philosophy in general. I mean, even the fact that I am already constructing some type of philosophy of timing, I would call also an aspect of
Sure.
chronopoesis, right? Because I had to sort of dedicate myself, my time to thinking about the problems that are missing. So because you often talk about this too, right? About how, thinkers are always missing something. There's
Right.
always something lacking in movements. But I actually think this is material that time gives us to play with, to use, to construct with. So I think that chronopoesis is more like how do we play with time as a sort of like responding, and calling, um, and formation of movements and everything else. Now, what I haven't got into is, can there be such things as like a bad chronopoesis? Can there be such a bad relation to time? I think I'm kind of hinting at that with destiny and fate,
Mm.
which I borrow actually from Buber,
Mm.
where he talks about, this is a matter of how we're facing. And then I think also, and I'll pass it on to you, is that I think what gets difficult with my philosophy of timing is that I feel like I'm trying to address not only a kind of phenomenology of timing, but also a hermeneutics of time itself, the way we
Sure.
sort of have a sort of language about time. And I'm mainly talking about, even when we have like just a regular discourse about when somebody talks to you and goes, "Hey, Daniel, when are you going to finish that book?" It's like there's a sort of discourse on time, a hermeneutics of time that is going on even when we talk about it, and everything else. But yeah.
I think that's excellent. I think language generally tends to reflect space instead of time, like points instead of development. It almost has to, right? Like if I were to say, like Daniel is finishing and one day finished, like language would be very convoluted if you tried to equally incorporate time and space into the linguistics. Like the moment I say I am Daniel, that's kind of a spatial statement because it doesn't say I am and becoming and developing Daniel would be more like space time. And then arguably, maybe it should just be pure time, like I Danieling, like with ing. There's a real sense in which every word should have an ing after it, right? And so the problem, though, is since language literally shapes the brain, like people think different according to the languages they learn, and the metaphor shape. So we kind of are forced by finitude to use spatial language to communicate effectively in a way that doesn't bog everything down. But that primes us then to talk about time as if it's space. Like time, the word time, as opposed to timing, is a spatial term. And so time gradually becomes space, and we don't even realize it. And then, of course, that just seeps into philosophy, seeps into theology, and it all becomes philosophies of space per se. And it becomes much more stagnant and doesn't have a lot of becoming. But then, of course, even talking about becoming can indirectly becomes talking about space, right? And that's why we talk about the becoming with the be in parentheses, which is both spatial into a kind of sublation, but also always becoming. And that's where Mr. Ebert's work in the Hegel collection, I think, is so valuable, because there's this weird way in which it's both and neither, right? And so that language is definitely part of the problem, and finitude itself, right? And language also through history is going to start off like language, the beginning of the development something, the beginnings of the development of something almost always reflect the facticity of which it originally confronts. And therefore, there are practical problems that are arising. So when you start speaking, you're not worried about, oh, is my language unintentionally communicating a metaphysics of space over time? You're just trying to get food. You're just looking for ways to send signals to the tribe, right? And to go. Well, then language stays there. And now when you get to about 2022 and you have the meaning crisis or the courage crisis, these different sociological phenomenon that are going on, then it becomes clear, oh, wait, this language that has gotten to us this point in history may actually be working against the new way we need to carry ourselves, which seems to have a lot more to do with time, timing, and becoming, because stable, stagnant identities are no longer plausible after the death of the paradigm that is the death of God, right? Now, even if, because that's always in Hegel, right? Like you were always operating according to a kind of mistake, but as long as the historical conditions did not make the mistake a mistake, it could still work and flow. You didn't have to worry about it. But now the historical conditions have changed where you have to worry about it, and you have to do this meta thing of like paying attention to language and what it does and different things like that. And that's where this conversation of timing, I just really, really like the word of timing, because I 100% agree that people's thinking about time has actually been spatial. It has not been thinking about time according to time, because the moment you do that, you have to think according to action. What I've always talked about is the phenomenology of art, the artistic act, this kind of this deep movement and becoming, and that's what I've always associated with it. But by thinking about timing, that's another angle to the conversation I believe is utterly invaluable. So I appreciate that. And a few more things. I think Caputo avoids the everyday because Derrida kind of avoids the everyday, because any talk about like what you ought to do in your everyday risks the very things that Derrida are deconstructing, right? Like there's impedance moral systems of how people should live and what they should do. So it's like, well, we don't want to do that. We just want to make a clearing and then people decide for themselves. That's good and all. But of course, the problem with that is if there's nothing, then people don't know how to carry themselves, right? It's like we talk about in belonging again, like if you have givens, sociological givens, like everyone is Christian, you have direction, but there's oppression, right? You don't have direction. And of course, I brought up gender, it's the same thing. If you have gender, males say, take care of the family, well, you have direction, but then that can be oppressive because the woman is forced to stay at home. Well, if you remove that given of gender, then you have to decide, well, what should gender be? And that could be existentially overwhelming, and people don't have direction. And in that lack of direction, people become pathological and people get mad and attack one another. In the same way that if you don't have direction on your everydayness, Derrida gives you a clearing, Caputo and different people talk about the clearing and you wait for the event in that clearing. Okay, but how should, I need to go to work though. What's the best way to carry myself at work? It's like, well, we don't want to say that because we don't want to create any normalities or norms that could restrict creative possibility in a Deleuzian sense. But of course, that's the whole problem of the spread and the scale and the Deleuzian individual and the Overman, right? Like to have literally no direction is philosophically and existentially very, very hard. You could say, well, everyone needs to, according to spiral dynamics, develop the consciousness that can handle that. Well, that's one strategy. Another strategy is to say, well, we have to think about new givens that don't oppress like the previous givens, and that's why I'm interested in this idea of kind of gender forgetfulness, because that's a way in which gender is deconstructed, but it's done through a forgetting about it by being capable in your gender of just carrying yourself in the world without making it a big deal, right? Like, if you go next door, because I always find, I was talking with Rob, it's like, if you go next door and your neighbor needs help cutting down a tree, it's precisely if you can't help with the tree that you actually reflect on your masculinity and become pathological and a jerk, right? But if you can just like cut down the tree because you know how to use a saw, you don't think about your masculinity. It's like actually having some of those masculine abilities is how you forget about masculinity, and you don't get the toxic masculinity. It seems to me the problem with the toxic masculinity or the false masculinity is the association of masculinity with some sort of status or some sort of power over other, as opposed to your own ability, so that you can kind of flow and not think about it. Like kind of the Heidegger's doorknob that doesn't work. Like you notice a doorknob when it breaks, right? Not when it works. So you're able to flow, and then it's about you having the skills, the timing, and ability to do these things so that you can flow, as opposed to lording it over other people or using it as a trophy. Because yeah, in my experience, like I always think about how a lot of the men who were most like jerks, frankly, were the ones who would talk the most about being men or kind of masculine. Now that's a generality. I mean, there is a certain degree like where there's a positive way to talk about it, right? But then there's also this kind of lording over it that's problematic. And it makes me think too how Ebert talks about excess and how excess becomes nothing, like it kind of vanishes. So likewise, when you have the abilities, you just don't think about masculinity because you've reached the place of saturation where you're using the skills to kind of help your neighbor, help other people, be there for your community. And it doesn't become like a status of, oh, I should control everything because I'm the man. Oh, I'm better than other people because I'm the man. And that makes me also then associate self-forgetfulness, gender forgetfulness with timing, art, lost in the moment. And that's and so I've been thinking about that, and it seems like there's something there with that, and that gets more into the, I completely agree with you, like Caputo and Derrida, and then I'll give it back to you. There's a lack of this kind of conversation about what is the everydayness, right? What is the everydayness in that clearing? And then also, of course, as you know, with Derrida, I think Derrida concludes basically you have to ignore the everyday because all metaphysics has been deconstructed. He's like, there's nothing we can do. We can't say anything about the everyday because metaphysics has been deconstructed. And that's why I disagree with him, because a metaphysics of apprehension, a metaphysics of the arts, the kind of the Aristotelian metaphysics is not deconstructed at all. And that can still be participated in.
Yeah, I mean, the everyday, because I've been thinking about this too. There's something in the footnote of the Prayers and Tears of Jacques Derrida from Caputo, where he talks about like Derrida basically wants, and me and Michelle got into this talk a bit too, where Derrida wants to make sure that we don't sort of regularize the subject, right? Wants to keep it capable of forming new subjectivities, right? However, and I think this kind of goes with your point too, and I think this will obviously go perfect in line with my notion of timing, is that if we think about repetition, right? Repetition, the everyday, sort of is already preparing us for the new form of subjectivity. Believe it or not, it's already happening. The problem is that we're very resistful against a new form of subjectivity emerging. And I gave an example of this with like Michelle, like for example, like becoming a mother, right? Becoming a mother is actually a new form of subjectivity.
Yes.
But when you become a mother, that's an open-ended question.
Right.
And the same thing with an open-endedness of when do you determine when you're actually a mother per se, you know, because it does have to do with values, and we have this perception of values about what does it mean to be a mother. But the moment you have children, you're already in the realm of a form of subjectivity called motherhood. And then what's ironic about that is that that form of subjectivity is going to change. Why? Because those children are going to get older, and you can no longer treat them the same that you were. So again, that subjectivity begins to form itself again. The problems that we end up having is that you get the mother that doesn't like to accept that her children are grown, you know, that are maybe not calling her mama anymore. They're just calling her like, hey, mom, right? There's like a language shift. But see, that's already an arising of a new subjectivity emerging. And so I think timing has a lot to do with the emergence of like new forms of subjectivity. The problem is, and I think maybe this is maybe you're getting at the point with Derrida, is that Derrida is trying to forcefully keep open forms of subjectivity, rather
Yes.
than the fact that actually everyday life, if we think about repetition seriously, if you think about tap, 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 but then all of a sudden it goes tap, 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 well, you're already in a new form of subjectivity.
Right.
There's an interval change.
Right.
Something happened. Um, and so I think in that sense, in the way I've been trying to, because I really do like Derrida, the more that I get to know him, and the same thing with Caputo, but I do think that philosophers, and I think this is the problem, is that they don't talk about how do we make decisions, or how do we deal with decisions that have already been previously made.
Right.
How do we deal with that? How do we deal with the fact that, what if I do regret something? How do I creatively construct that into my life, and so on? And I think Dawood, and I'll pass it on to you after this. Dawood said something very fascinating in your talk with him about he said that he didn't like his people at work, like sort of like that this is all of their identity, right?
Yeah.
And then Dawood said that he'd like to just read a book and just engage in something mindless, and something just in the moment. But you see, Dawood is getting at something like he's willing to engage like in a new form of subjectivity that doesn't involve work.
Right.
And I think that's a lot of our issues, is that we're not open to new forms of subjectivity. And yeah, so
I think it's excellent. Thank you for listening to that talk. I love speaking with Dawood. He's great. He's magic. He's straight magic. I think what you just described as resisting new forms of subjectivity. I think if we think of that instead of the event, like we need to be open to new forms of subjectivity, that's where you start moving the thinking of Derrida and Caputo into the everyday. And indeed, we have a natural resistance to new forms of subjectivity as we resist changes the paradigm, the death of God, the loss of givens, and we tend to become pathological, neurotic, turn to strongmen, all of that other stuff. And that's what tends to occur. And so the question is, how can we be ready for new forms of subjectivity? Mentioning Derrida, and this would apply to Judith Butler, Foucault, all these other people. I just think in Deleuze, obviously I have many times, quote unquote, made arguments where I think they're incomplete or there's problems or so on and so forth. But I think it's always just so important to have a note of sympathy when these individuals probably lived through or have family that lived through all of the totalitarian world wars of the world, like giant totalitarian forces where they have seen closeness, givenness, stable gender, stable identity cause oppression. And so they're in and basically too, the human race was just introduced to the atom bomb. Oh, for the first time in human history, we now have the ability to kill everyone. And we see where closeness got us, to World War II. So basically, emergency, boom, we got to break up closeness because we got atom bombs. And sure, yeah, maybe we'll go too far. Maybe we'll take out stable identity too much. Maybe we'll create Deleuzian individuals and only a few people can survive that. But it's better to overfit that and save the world from the totalitarianism of closeness than to underfit it and we all get nuked, right? So I have a lot of sympathy for their emphasis on opening things up. They've also seen racism. They've, obviously all the racism on planet Earth, whether it be in Nazi Germany, America, all over the world, there's all these forms of racism, there's all these forms of oppression, and they're trying to stop that. That's where Foucault's work comes in. Now, the issue becomes, and I think the older Foucault realizes this, and a lot of the sociologists realize this, that if you have like Peter Berger, all the people I love to talk about, they realize that if you open it up too much, it creates an existential instability that actually, ironically, then makes totalitarianism appealing because it's too much for people to have total openness because they don't have direction and they're existentially overwhelmed. And you create the quote what Vervaeke calls the meaning crisis, as we've talked about and critique the language. But that's a sociological phrase that refers to all this, so on, so forth. So now what's starting to happen is the realization of, okay, we had the Enlightenment project, which was too closed, that calls totalitarianism. And now we've had the response to that to open things up to make sure that we don't create World War III that kills us all. But now we're seeing that pure autonomous openness doesn't work. Okay, so how do we slide back a little bit toward the middle? Now, I hate using the phrase middle because I don't like this moralization of the middle, but dialectical, or how do we sublate? If postmodernity is a kind of negation of modernity, how do we sublate it? And of course, in Hegel, the next step, if we're thinking in terms of his dialectic of science, is going to be the concrete. Well, then it's going to make sense that the bringing together of these things, I almost said synthesis, which would have been cardinal sin. The bringing together of these things has something to do with lived experience, everyday life, timing, art, immersion, practice. It would make sense that it's going to be in that realm that our thinking needs to occur. And it is in that realm that you experience new forms of subjectivity come unto you. Because here's a key point. If you're a mother, so you're say before you're married and you don't have kids, then you enter into having a mother, you're a mother, then you have a new form of subjectivity, and then the kids leave, that's a new form of subjectivity. You actually don't experience new forms of subjectivity except in lived experience. We just thought it. That was not a new form of subjectivity. That was a mapping of the new forms of subjectivity. So the only way to actually have new forms of subjectivity is literally an experience and life and the concrete. So it would make sense that like that's everything then, because if a single form of subjectivity creates totalitarianism, okay, but then no subjectivity, like no stable subjectivity creates existential chaos, fashion, all these kind of reactions we're seeing today, meaning crisis or whatever. The answer then has to be changing subjectivity, where you have a time where this is your subjectivity and it's relatively stable, but it's conditionally stable. Then it changes, and that would be the only option left, right? Is some kind of changing of it. And that's why thinking about bringing the events into the realm of changing forms of subjectivity. Because to me, like I brought up gender, like when you start talking about masculine to masculine forgetfulness, that's a changing subjectivity. You now relate to your masculinity as something you don't think about, because you've worked it to a place where you're just able to, whatever comes your way, you're able to, like an improv master, take it on, not in a dominant way, but in a way that solves it, that deals with the situation and adds value. So you don't reflect on yourself and then create a pathological response. So there are these new forms of subjectivity that seem to be the only possible response. And so the issue is, again, and then I'll give it back to you, you don't see that in Derrida, in Caputo, or even, I think if Foucault would have lived longer, you may have seen it because his older thinking is so different. But I'm also sympathetic to the fact you don't see it, because literally nukes have just been created. You're in a Cold War. Like, it does indeed. Like right now with everything going on in the world, we feel like we all might die. We kind of forget the historic moment and intensity of like the world during the Cold War. And they have seen where closedness gets you to millions upon millions upon millions of people dead. And so their emphasis is going to be on stopping that. But what we have to realize today is that that isn't going to be able to carry you through, because there tends to be a response to autonomous openness that's pathological and creates a lot of problems. So now the question is, what does it mean to engage in philosophies of changing subjectivity, coming to terms with that, timing that, and so on and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that, yeah, I'm glad you brought this up, because this was something that I was thinking about too. When we think about Heidegger, Derrida, Deleuze, I mean, they're all responding to an event, something crucial within the context of their own history. And I think that's where their thinking is most important. I think if you think about it, whether they were correct or wrong, they gave the best response that they thought was correct for the moment that it was occurring.
Yes.
And this is why I came up with the term chronopoiesis, because I feel like chronopoiesis is exactly this, where we have to understand that in the current context of time, we have to respond.
Yes.
But of course, we can't just simply abide by Heidegger's philosophy, Derrida's philosophy. We have to respond to the actual event of what is going on. And that would mean that actually, in this case, it's very possible within this context of time that, yes, at this moment, Derrida is wrong, or Heidegger is wrong. That we have to respond in such a way that we utilize them as sort of like material that we can respond with to the proper moment. And the funny thing is that even if I'm wrong per se, right? Even if somebody like goes like 20 years from now and they're like, well, I think Javier's philosophy of timing completely wrong, I would accept that fully, just because I would be like, yeah, that's another aspect of chronopoiesis, because I need to be wrong.
Right.
But at the same time, I needed to respond to what I felt was a good answer at the time. And I think this is what we keep missing. And so what you were getting at with the openness, it's funny because the philosophy of timing, if we think about intervals, right? The assumption is that always open is good, right? Always open is good. But I actually think there's moments where being closed is perfect, perfectly fine in the case of a certain, in the sense of like allowing time to sort of be part of the creative act itself,
Right.
if that makes any sense, right? Like, it's like we don't close it indefinitely, but we close it as a part of a creative response towards the moment.
Yes.
And I think actually the way you're getting at with this sort of self-forgetfulness is a way to close without it being indefinite,
Yes.
so to speak, right? And
Yes.
I and it's a creative response, but it's a way of working with time as time gives you material to sort of respond. And so that's why I think, if we think about rhythm and intervals, there's moments where things are closed and open. So
Yes.
it's all about what you feel is the correct response. And of course, in that moment, it could be wrong, but it's always hard to say, you know.
Oh yeah. Well, it seems very natural on the idea of self-forgiveness. For example, like you have to think about yourself and what you want to do to determine what choices you make and how you should allocate your time, right? So there has to be a time of focused on the self, but you focus on yourself to forget the self in the act. That's the difference. It seems actually natural for us to do the exact opposite. Like we think about ourselves when we're around other people, and then when we're like by ourselves, we're not thinking about that. We're just kind of doing and consuming. And we actually tend to forget ourselves in our free time and remember ourselves when we're like how we feel at work and how people are treating us. And we become very self-focused when really it should be the exact opposite. Like you should be focused on yourself and how you're using your time and what you do like in your free time so that you're actually creating value. And then when you're in community and around other people, you forget yourself. You're not thinking about how you stack up against them but we tend to do the exact opposite. And it seems like it takes training and intention, if you will, to get that fixed. And in the same way, you're not going to be able to say, help your neighbor cut up their tree if you don't think about how to use a chainsaw, right? There has to be a time where you think about that and you say, I want to be able to help people with this tool. So you think about it. But then when it comes to the tree being over, because you did that work, you can forget about the fact that you need to done that work because you've done it. You can just flow, right? Whereas if you didn't know how to do that and you go over and the tree has fallen, you go, wow, I don't know how to use a chainsaw. And your neighbor's like, can you help me? I'm like, yeah, I can't. And your neighbor's like, you can't? And you're like, you're right, I can't. And then you're like, well, yeah, I can't. And then you like shoot back at them, right? It's like precisely when we think about ourselves in the context of others, we become jerks. But in order to not do that, there's a work of like a closeness of focusing on the self in our free time when we're by ourselves per se, which we tend to not want to do because that's existentially terrifying, right? Like it's funny how it's existentially terrifying to think about yourself when you're alone, but it's so like existentially relieving to think about yourself when you're with other people. It's like the exact opposite. When you're with other people thinking about how you feel and how you stack up and how you stand, there's something that's like natural about that as opposed to thinking what they think and what they're doing and what they need, because you can't access the conscious of other people. And so it's a mystery and it's kind of frightening, right? So we tend to get at the exact opposite of what we need to do. Basically, that's almost always the case because of our ironic fallen nature. Like whatever the thing is we need to do, we tend to do the reverse of that at the wrong timing. This is why I think timing is so good, is because, yeah, you want to focus on yourself in your free time when you're alone, as opposed to just forgetting yourself in the joys of consuming Netflix or whatever. See, we tend to do self-forgetfulness in consumption instead of self-forgetfulness in the presence of others. Because in the presence of others, it's super hard, but it's really easy to do it in consumption when it needs to be the exact opposite. You're aware of, wait a minute, I've just been watching Netflix for 5 hours. Maybe I shouldn't do that. Actually, in that context, remembering your self-remembrance is good in a way, right? But that is, I think, where it's all about timing, like the closeness and openness. And in self-forgetfulness, you have done enough self-work so that you can just be open to what is presented because you're able to improv and address it and to be there and not to turn on status anxiety. So I think exactly what you say. It's a matter of kind of the music of it.
Yeah, it like I think intersubjective relations is always interesting because there's so many ways to interpret, like you said, about you know, like, oh, you don't know how to like, you know, cut this tree, you don't know like how to help me with this. Um, it's funny because even that language itself is already indicating like a new form of subjectivity that
Yes.
you've never been acquainted to,
Yes.
right? Like you don't know what it means or feel like to be a man that cuts trees or something like that. So, but it's funny because we're always resistant against that. Like, no,
Yes.
no, no, no. Like we somehow we want to be very stagnant in our subjectivity, or we feel very insecure about our subjectivity. But to get to your point, the utility of this idea of like self-forgetting is I feel like it's really the only way that we could ever be possibly open to new forms of subjectivity,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Because it allows us to sort of relinquish the form of subjectivity that we're sort of clenching on, gripping so tightly, um, that you know, if if the interaction were to go a little different, like, oh, you know, you're right, I don't know how to do this, but I can help you if you know, teach me sometime later on, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
in case this interaction ever happens again, you know, maybe not today I can't help you, but if you're willing to teach me later on, then I totally will be happy to help you, you know. So it's about being open to that new form of subjectivity.
Yes.
And it's funny because it's at that moment, at that timing, it's like timing itself is already indicating to you that you can take this new form of subjectivity to your benefit if you want to.
Right.
But you should never take it in the sense of like some kind of begrudgingly demasculating effect or something like that.
Well, and I'll add that it's inevitable that you eventually encounter something that you can't do, because even if you could do the tree, you can't do the pipes, or you don't know enough about economics to speak to their interests, right? Or you can't entertain the kids because you're not a good storyteller. So it's inevitable that some temptation of self-remembering in the context of the other arises. But if you at least know that what's optimal is self-forgetting, then you carry yourself in that situation to respond with a, well, no, I don't know how to use the chainsaw, but maybe I can like work the tractor, or I can move the limbs, or maybe you can teach me sometime. Like, you know that if you get stuck here in this talking about like your inability and you're remembering yourself, it's very likely that you're either going to go in the direction of like a sad sort of I'm useless, or you're going to go in an egotistical like, yeah, I can't use it, but guess what I can do? I'm the CEO of a company, so I don't need to know how to do a chainsaw. Like, it's either going to go in like a sad, deconstructive, like depressed response, or you're going to have an egotistical, pathological response. So if you know that, then when you encounter that, you know that you know what you need to return to, a self-forgetfulness. So how you respond to that situation is different. You say, no, I don't know how to do that, but maybe I can move the limbs, I can do the tractor, or maybe you can teach me sometime. So having the right metric or the right goal is a huge deal, because if you don't know that, then you don't know what to look for, how to practice yourself in that situation. And that's why for me, Keller's work was such a big deal, because that third category of self-forgetting I never even thought of. And it's funny because forgetting sounds kind of, it's funny because it's practice. The goal is so similar to deconstructive, because you're forgetting the thing, but it's a forgetting from like a kind of, it's from a skill, from a kind of excess, from a kind of ability where you're confident, so you don't have to think about it, as opposed to a kind of annihilation that then doesn't seem like it works, because it tends to create pathological responses to it. So that as a category was extremely helpful. And then, because then what you're doing, and then I'll pass it back to you, instead of asking, who am I? It does change the focus on what am I doing? Like, what am I doing? How am I carrying myself in the world? But then change the focus onto things like timing and skill and art and relation to others, as opposed to identity that you become focusing on. You forget about identity in favor of the just doing of who you are, which of course entails an identity, but it's like Lot's wife. You don't look at it, because the moment you look at it, it turns to salt or something, right? It's there, but it's used like your thumb is used, and becomes invisible in that use. It's there, but it becomes kind of invisible, like that doorknob.
Like yeah, I've been slowly getting away from like this idea of like identity, because I feel like that's a lot of like what the Enlightenment sort of like obsessed
Yeah.
upon, like identity this, and I think this is why I'm starting to like Derrida. Derrida sort of like gets away from this kind of like
Yes.
notion a little bit, where he says, well, it's more about the discourse that sort of
Mm-hmm.
inscribes the subject. But I think that is a perfect I think that's a perfect opening for everyday discourse or
Yes.
everyday sort of reality where it's like, you know, if you understand that your everydayness already has a sort of inscription within the discourse of your life, um, this is already playing into effect the moment you encounter somebody like, you're just doing your job and someone says, hey, I think you're really good at this. Have you ever considered, this before? Right? That's already an invitation for a new form of subjectivity. That's
Right.
already an invitation for a new notion of life. And I really like poets like Fernando Pessoa, for example, because I think he's a perfect example of somebody that took the notion of what Derrida talks about, the subject is inscribed, and he cultivated so many alter egos and personalities within his writing that you can really see how this man, I mean, it's very difficult to say what Fernando Pessoa was because he entertained so many forms of subjectivity
Yes.
within that. But I do think, this is the part where I know this is a bad thing to do when we're talking about. We have a tendency to cut time as if it's such a decisive thing. We tend to objectify time when we make decisions or cut it. And it kind of relates to when I didn't think about how a lot of my thinking has been slowly cultivating into the philosophy of timing, actually.
Sure.
Remember my old work on invisible work?
Yeah, 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 yeah. Oh, yes.
I think that actually is like a perfect example of like timing, where it's like just because you don't see a man
Yes.
um, cultivating his work in a manifest way, he is still working
Yes.
on something, right? He's still thinking and trying to construct something despite his years of absence. Um, but yeah, I mean, identity and manhood. I mean, to give you like a real example of like, how I sort of shifted my relationship with my father,
Mm.
I entertained a new form of subjectivity, right?
Yes.
Where I said, how, how does it feel to have a relationship with my father instead of as a father, but more like person to person, right? What does it mean to meet my father as a person rather than a father? So instantly, I'm willing to succeed myself or secede myself away from being son to person, random person, or just person meeting another person. And so I'm willing to enter myself into a new form of subjectivity to cultivate a new relation. And instantly, what happens with that is a retroactive occurrence happens where now I can reestablish a new relationship with my father while still considering him father.
Right.
And it did take a moment of self-forgetfulness, a self-forgetfulness of being son, as identifying oneself as son, to be able to be open to this new form of subjectivity. So
That's
I,
right.
I think, I mean, I think that's such a brilliant concept, self-forgetting in that case.
Well, because it's like work forgetting, right? It's like invisible work, and you in your dating work, there's a way in which when you think about dating consciously and how you're doing in the dating, it sucks, right? So there's a dating forgetfulness, there's a work forgetfulness, and the idea of identity forgetfulness. Because one of the reasons I'm very sympathetic toward so many of the postmodern thinkers, and I mentioned Butler or Charles W. Mills on race or different things, is because there seems to be a big problem with identity, right? But the issue is, it's kind of like, so they'll talk about in gender studies the difference between sex and gender, right? Like sex is your biology, gender is what you think that means, right? I think it helps when we understand that identity is always an interpretation, and that's why Derrida is concerned about interpretation. And the problem is what we tend to do is assume the interpretation equals the thing, right? We say, oh, gender equals sex because interpretation equals sex, when it does not. Like if you decide that masculinity means X, Y, and Z, that is not found in the biological facticity of maleness, right? You are deciding that. So the idea is, well, we need to deconstruct the gender, right? And liberate people from gender. And that's true, but the problem is that there still is the facticity of sex. There still is the facticity, and you still have to interpret it. Likewise, if I say there's no such thing as Daniel, well, I still have to interpret myself. I can never escape the interpretive act because it is a result of a facticity. The problem I think that kind of happens in some of the deconstructionists is they'll say like, you know, interpretation, it's just an interpretation. That's true, but there's a thing that's being interpreted. Like that's where I go after, you know, where I critique Derrida is like, yes, Derrida, you're correct. The signifier can never equal the signified, but there is still an apprehension that arose to that gap in the first place. Like, yes, gender does not equal sex, but there has to be a sex that arose to the gender in the first place. It's like, yes, identity does not equal Javier. Daniel does not equal your idea of Daniel. But there has to be a Daniel, a thing, a collection of facticity that arose to that interpretation in the first place. And you cannot escape interpretation. You cannot escape having notions of who you think you are. That's unavoidable. So instead of acting like that's possible, because when you do, then everyone kind of has to almost exist in a kind of pathological bad faith where you have to have ideas of what you think sex means, but then pretend like you don't. You have to have ideas of who you think you are as Daniel, but then pretend like you don't. It becomes very weird and confusing, and everyone gets nervous and anxious and they don't know what they're thinking. But if instead you start talking about, no, yes, Daniel, of course you're going to have an interpretation of who you are because you have to, but you need to forget it. You need to forget about it. Likewise, it's like, of course you're going to have an interpretation of what you think sex means, but how do you carry yourself in a world where you forget about it and you don't think about that interpretation as if it equals reality itself? Well, that comes to a place of how do you carry yourself where you've mastered timing, you've mastered skill, you've mastered carrying yourself in the world as Daniel, so that it doesn't make you reflect on who am I? Right? And that's where you come to be confident in yourself. You're not reflecting on yourself. Likewise, you're not reflecting on what does it mean to be a man all the time. Because if you do that, then you become pathological in relation to what you think about as a man. Or you're like, what does it mean to be a good worker? Or what does it mean to be a good boyfriend? Well, you become neurotic. Like what you're seeing happen in regard to identity, in regard to gender, in regard to dating, in regard to work. All of these are examples where people are either A, acting like identity is real, and it's not, it's just an interpretation. It's not facticity. In a sense, it's real because you think it is, but it's not grounded in facticity. So all the deconstructionists were right about that. But then there's another response where you say, well, we can just get rid of interpretation. No, you can't, because you can't avoid interpretation. And likewise, you can't avoid interpretation because you're interacting with other people that you have to be intelligible to. And they need kind of like, if they're going to relate to you, they have to have some kind of notion of who you are. And so you have to give them a map, even if it's not the territory. You have no choice. Like the only way you can avoid interpretation is to not be around other people. And and this is really important. I think the mistake Derrida makes is kind of, he's like, well, it's just interpretation. And that doesn't mean interpretation is necessarily bad. It's unavoidable. As if that would deconstruct social conventions. Interpretation is always a social convention, because if you were alone in the forest, you wouldn't interpret, you would just take in. The moment you use the word interpretation, you're talking about a social construction. You're talking about a social setting, right? So to say that interpretation therefore invalidates the social construction doesn't make sense, because the word itself is social, right? The issue is how to forget about it in the social convention, not to say deconstruct it in the social convention. And that's an entirely different practice. That's practices, that's skills, that's learning to live with yourself in a non-neurotic way. That's learning to date someone and not think about yourself as a boyfriend, that when you do that, you feel inadequate, or you become overly compensating, you become controlling or something like that. So forgetfulness is a form of kind of confidence that is more like an excess than a deconstruction and an absence, that allows you to forget about it because you carry yourself in a world to where you're not reflecting on yourself and trying to defend an identity of which would make you oppressive. So to me, the kind of notion of self-forgetfulness is how you take the lessons of deconstruction to avoid the problems of, say, modernity, but then not take deconstruction to where it just ends up in the kind of the post-modernity ends that seem to be quite nihilistic and inadequate. Because ultimately you can't avoid interpretation as long as you're in a society.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're absolutely right. Like, this is something that I kind of saw on Caputo, where it's like, even though we're supposed to, there's something that's supposed to be kind of undecidable about, his notion of like perhaps, right?
Yes.
And we're always supposed to like keep open. But something that I noticed, and you got at this too, is that, well, I mean, if everything's an interpretation, well, the thing is we have to respond either way.
Yes, exactly. You
We
can't
always
avoid
have to respond. And this has always been like, my critical philosophy is that even a sort of stance of like, well, perhaps, and perhaps, in order to keep things open ended, but we still have to respond.
Yes.
So
Yes.
it doesn't matter per se. I mean, it does matter that we have to make sure that we maintain an open-endedness, but we still have to respond. We still have to decide. We still have to go with an interpretation, unfortunately. Um, and so that's the risk. That's the risk we take.
Right.
And this is where like I feel like I'm combining a bit of Buber and Derrida together, because Buber does this big exposition in Between Man and Man about, making a decision. And the point is that you don't know if it's going to be the best or the worst decision. But the thing is, you have to.
Yes.
You have to make a decision
Yes.
anyways.
Yes.
And that's why I feel like deconstruction, I'm starting to notice, it has been good for theology.
Yes,
The
actually,
way
that yes,
Caputo has
yes,
been putting it.
yes,
The way Caputo has been doing it has been good for theology. However, deconstruction by itself without theology is the part, and I think that's what you're getting at, because
yes,
and I think Johannes is, hitting on the nail on this head too. But I think specifically for theology, deconstruction has been very beneficial in this case.
Well, because in theology it leads to the apathetic, whereas in philosophy it leads to the nothing. Well, actually, it just leads to neo-pragmatism, is what happens. Is you're like, okay, philosophy, like once you deconstruct philosophy, it's like, well, it's dead, and you just end up in Richard Rorty and like a lot of the neo-pragmatists, which don't get me wrong, I have a really healthy respect for pragmatists like C.S. Pierce, but like Richard Rorty is a different ballgame, although I kind of like him. It just depends. But you see, that's all you can do. Like philosophy is going to end up in some form of pragmatism or trolley problems. But theology ends up in the apathetic, or it ends up in a blend of the Thomist and the apathetic, which both of those are positive. And that's why it's very interesting that deconstruction in the form of a Caputo, Peter Rollins, James K. Smith, even. I actually, funny enough, James K. Smith, I think, wrote the best book on Derrida out there. And he's like a Reformed theologian or whatever. I'm not sure where he associates. So, no, deconstruction, like theology is like perfect for deconstruction, because the whole idea is who the heck do you think you are to say what God is? You just need to like be open and take your sandals off. Whereas, take your sandals off. God's a burning bush right now. Why is God a burning bush? Shut up. Take your sandals off. The event is right there. Whereas in philosophy, deconstruction, unless it ends up in Hegel, because Hegel or something, or David Hume, and that's that whole conversation, if it's not coupled with a metaphysics, which I think it can be, but it has to be the metaphysics of apprehension, and then we get into alterology and all the stuff I love to talk about, it ends up pathological. It ends up completely destroyed. Well, I keep talking about gender because I've been thinking about that subject, and it's and the thing is, like, for example, female, like Adrienne Font, who I love Adriana, and she does great work at the store, which will talk about menstrual cycles and menstrual celebrations. Like, the female has menstruation. That is an unavoidable facticity of sex. It is not a social construct. It is there. It occurs. The gender is your interpretation of what you think that means. Now, a lot of the trouble comes where somebody goes, okay, women menstruate, therefore women must have children. You see, that's where you start to get the oppression, right? Because you're saying that the menstruation means a given woman must do a given thing. And that's the interpretation that becomes oppressive. But you see, you must respond to the reality of menstruation, as the male must respond to the sex drive, the libido. You don't have a choice. Now, should X interpretation of male libido be the objective reality that everyone follows? Well, that's where you get all your trouble, right? In the same way that women, if they said, well, you menstruate, you can have children, therefore you must. That's where you get into all those problems. But you cannot, the mistake is to say, because it is possible to have oppressive interpretations, therefore you shouldn't have interpretations. You should just have individual interpretations, right? That decide for themselves what they mean. Well, that's closer to the truth. But the issue is, in the same way that Wittgenstein warned there's no such thing as a private language, right? There's no such thing as a private language. There's no such thing as a private interpretation. There's no such thing as a private gender.
There's no such thing as a private identity. There's no such thing as a private anything, because all of these are giving information to other people to help them figure out how they should respond to you. And they must respond to you because they saw you. And does it feel good when they ignore you? Like that doesn't work. To some degree it works, but it's like there's a balance between these things. So interpretation is always in the business. Your interpretation of X, Y, and Z is your signaling mechanism to other people of how they should respond to you. And you see, here's the issue. If the amount of signals that people are getting are too vast or too different between every person they run into, they are existentially overwhelmed and society begins to fragment. That's the law. That's why the loss of givens tends to lead to, like, you know, fascism and totalitarianism and strongmen, because people are overwhelmed with having to re-describe themselves to every person they run into, because they have a different idea of what it means to be Christian, a different idea of what it means to be a hard worker, and people get exhausted by that perpetual rethinking everything all the time, which becomes unavoidable if you have a bunch of private interpretations, which don't exist. So what we're doing under deconstruction, one applied to sociology and different things, is we're acting as if private interpretation does not have a social cost, when it has a massive social cost. It overwhelms other people. And so everyone just, what happens is everyone pulls apart into their groups. You know, and so then you, of course, get the conservatives not talking with the liberals, the atheists not talking to the Christians. Everyone is splitting apart. That's what everyone's saying. Oh, the world is splitting apart. Now, if someone wants to make an argument that that's a good thing, you know, that would be the next step in belonging. Then, like, if you want to, like, like that, basically, as far as I understand him, Alexander Dugin with the fourth political theory, it's like, it's actually better if global, you know, separation, everyone divides apart in different things. And it would be better if the world was a collection of tribes and separated nations. Okay, well, that's a debate that has to be had. But that is where treating interpretation as if it is private and individual leads you. That's where it almost has to lead you, because unless the average person on planet Earth is an absolute knower. That's what we've been talking about, a Deleuzian individual who can handle every single encounter, that level of reinterpretation, reintroduction, and rethinking, right? To handle that level of radical difference all the time. It's not impossible, but if it is the case that only a minority of people can do that, or it's just practically the case that will always be, well, then that strategy, that deconstruction postmodern strategy, will not practically work, because it demands too much of people in every single introduction of individuals. Now, if you as a postmodern want to come along and say, well, tough, because it's ethically wrong to do anything else, okay, well, then that's your belief. That's your religion now, that there's a kind of ethical drive that the world ought to be a place where the average person can handle that level of constant reintroduction and reinterpretation and not be existentially overwhelmed. Do you think it will work? Do you think it will happen? Well, there's a real risk here, because if not, we're going to end up basically in World War III, or everyone like socially pulling apart and, you know, riots on the street, and balkanization is ultimately what you get. You know, a lot of the world has balkanized, right? That is what's going to occur. Maybe you say, well, we have no choice but to take the risk. Okay, but for me, I can see ways where you can get the same result that the postmoderns are after without the same risk, by emphasizing forgetfulness. So to me, that's a much more rational strategy, because you can get all the difference, all the variation from a place of forgetfulness, as opposed to a place of deconstruction that seems as if it is, it's begging a standard that is either going to lead everyone into Duginism, or it's going to lead into an existential state of overwhelming that's going to lead into totalitarianism. So for me, that's where the category of forgetfulness is a big deal, because you can get some of the benefits of postmodernity without necessarily the same risks that don't seem like you need to take. But of course, the question becomes, can the average person deal with forgetfulness? Can the average person enter into that? Well, then that would, of course, be the question.
It almost makes me think, because post-modernity seems to be responding to strong interpretations, very strong interpretations of reality, right? And so they're trying to deconstruct that. But then it seems like they go like the other extreme, where it's like, okay, it's just an interpretation. I think to kind of play Caputo on his, put Caputo on his head, I almost feel like perhaps it's better to have weak interpretations. Like,
yes,
because then it kind of
open-handed, kind of,
yeah, it kind
the
of
verb
answers something in the sense of like, I have to respond. I have to respond. I'm sort of powerless against this necessity to respond and decide. But but it is because I'm powerless and I have to respond that my interpretation is always going to be weak, so to speak. And I have been thinking lately, and this is obviously some new thought that I've been unsure to present, but because I've been thinking about how do I deconstruct Thomas Aquinas. There is something that kind of triggered an idea because Bobic, in his interpretation of being in essence from Thomas Aquinas, he talks about how Aquinas makes this. He talks about genus and how genus is special in the sense that it has like a kind of imprecision to it. It has meaning, but it also doesn't exclude the another meaning or something like that. It doesn't exclude. So there's this aspect of imprecision that I think is actually very useful, that should be incorporated in our notion of weak interpretation, where you give meaning to something because you have to, right? But then you understand that your meaning is very weak because it has a sort of imprecision to it, means that the very thing outside of that meaning isn't excluded from that itself. So I think there's ways to play with this idea of like, a sort of imprecision. The utility of imprecision is actually very helpful because one, we have to decide, we have to give meaning, we have to do something about this. But we also understand that because there's imprecision, whatever is unknown, uneventful, is not excluded.
Right.
And I think that's the concern of, deconstruction, is that, we have to keep something open-ended. But I think the open-endedness is actually the result of imprecision.
Well, the thing that happens if you're always open-ended, then it's not open-ended that you're open-ended. So you create a closed without realizing it. That's the great kind of contradiction of deconstruction. If you're like, well, everything has to be deconstructed, you go, well, what about deconstruction? Does that get deconstructed? So you can't escape this problem. And that's why for me, like I've told Philippe this and different people, like when I was younger, I had no time for Hegel. Like I couldn't stand Hegel. I was much more in like, I read a lot of Wittgenstein, a lot of the analytical philosophers. I was very interested in precise language, and I got very interested in the Scottish Enlightenment, economics, Hayek, and different things like that. But then once I kind of got to once I got to the place where I found that Hegel was actually like finding this hole where you say, oh, you can't cross the noumenon. Well, is that across the noumenon? Is that idea across the noumenon? Like, oh, and if it is, how does the brain work? Because that little problem right there opens an entire horizon of different things. And then once it became clear to me that Hegel ultimately was thinking the concrete, like it was in the concrete. He should not be called an idealist. Like, I'm not sure if where it's like the German idealist or whatever. I think that's a problem, because Hegel is not really an idealist in the same way that we call like Heidegger an existentialist. Yes, there are existential elements of Heidegger, but he is not the same as, say, other existentialists, in the same way that, yes, there is idealistic tendencies in Hegel, but he is not ultimately just an idealist. There is a concrete reality that is ultimately the grounds of the entire operation. But anyway, deconstruct, you have to ultimately have something you don't deconstruct to make deconstruction possible. In the same way that there ultimately has to be something that you don't interpret, mainly that you must interpret. There's a givenness that has to be located in that. And the moment you have just that one little weak spot, well, then everything changes. Like that's not what's going on. There is an assumption. There is a real choice. There is something that's being absorbed as if it must be treated as the case, not open-ended. And so for me, what this means, so modernity was the one philosophy. We're all Christians, so we're right. Then post-modernity is like many ones. It's like, well, you have your truth, I have my truth, and you have, your idea of different things. And what today we're saying is like the one open to the many is kind of what you need in meta-modernity. So it's like
you have to have an idea of what you think is the case, and it not just be a mere interpretation. It has to be what you think is actually true. Otherwise, you would not ascribe to it. But it is always open to the many caveats and transformations. Because if you do the one of modernity, you end up with totalitarianism. But if you do the many ones, you end up with a society where nobody can understand one another because the signals are too messed up and everyone gets existentially overwhelmed and eventually just withdraws. So what you have to have is a one that is open to the many. And that is what we're talking about here, where you say, well, I've decided that my libido as a male means that I should work out, but I am open to men who instead direct their libido and sexual energy towards, say, reading or studying or running. I don't run, I don't do those things, or they direct it toward putting it toward their work or something, or actually to taking care of children or something, right? So you're open to other men interpreting the meaning of their sex to have gender be another thing, but at the same time, you're not denying the existence of sex, right? And you're also not pretending as if it doesn't have a real influence and impact on how you live your life. It is there. It is there to be interpreted. You must respond to it, but you're also open to other responses to it. And you're also open to you changing your response, right? Maybe you grew up your entire life thinking that a male, for example, should not take care of kids, right? But then you get later on, you're like, you know, it actually takes a lot of courage and to actually watch kids, for example, because all day they may swallow something. Like you have to have a lot of courage to like watch kids, right? Well, isn't courage traditionally associated with men? Right. So actually, and this is the other problem that has happened, like certain virtues are associated with other, like with different genders or whatever. Women have courage all the time because like they're holding a kid. What if they drop the kid? They have to watch the kid. You know, they're going to work, you know, like walking at night. They can be attacked, right? There's courage constantly. And the man will find in these things that are courage, right? So then you're opening like, well, hold on, you know, I was, because I was raised in a more traditional household, I was given the impression that masculinity was not involved in this, but actually I can see how masculinity is involved in this because there are things like courage, and it is tiring and exhausting and requires a lot of work to say, watch the kids all day. So then you can respond to the sex of male in a new way, right? So that's where you're open to a different direction. And so that seems to be what we need to do, is to have a one that is open to the many, whereas where deconstruction or like an ever open-endedness is, it's a contradiction because it's not open to not having an open-endedness. So that can't be the direction. What it has to be is something solid that is open at the same time. And that requires courage, and that requires timing. That requires the ability to respond to new things you don't expect, and so on and so forth.
It almost makes me think, just to kind of use Caputo against himself. It's like, because now I want to reframe the weak interpretation as, instead of it being necessarily opposed to strong or weak, but a weak interpretation would be being open to the folliness, the possibility of your own folly.
Yeah. Open
of your interpretation.
Yeah, it's
kind of your interpretation.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And so that means that even deconstruction has to be sort of open to their own folly.
Yes.
Meaning that there would be moments where you do have to be closed.
Yes.
Perhaps, right? Perhaps. And this is, it's funny that you bring up this argument because it reminds me of like Jung when I was reading him, and he would say something like, he strives so hard to not be dogmatic or something, right? He's very anti-dogmatic, but it's so funny that he's so anti-dogmatic because he becomes so anti-dogmatic that he becomes dogmatic about being anti-dogmatic, right? So that's like the contradiction that he finds himself in when he's opposing Freud and his dogmatism.
Yes.
Right. And I think that's what the same thing deconstruction kind of falls into, like and you see this with the left, right? The progressive left, like everything needs to be progressive. Well, does everything need to be progressive? That's, you know, that is, we cannot determine, right? There's a certain danger to always something being progressing, because one, we have to determine if the progress that we're making is actually good or actually bad. And I think you get that sort of dialectic from the right, where the right is saying not all progressiveness is good. Right. But of course, you can't take everything that the conservative says in its totality, because they want to sort of have everything remain closed and preserved. But again, the reason why the conservative has some utility to it is because they're trying to point at a danger about that not all progressiveness is good. And the progressive is trying to say the same thing to the conservative in the sense that not all conservation is good. Unfortunately, that is not how it happens. They just say each other's wrong and they're stupid and, read some, real academic articles about life and politics. And then, maybe you'll make the right decision. That's kind of what they say to each other.
Oh yeah, and I should add, like, one of the reasons why I said it mentioned going back to Hegel is because Hegel was the only one that I could find that actually was aware of this problem of one open to the many. Like the problem of open-endedness that's always open-ended isn't open-ended. And like, what does that mean about the nature of reality and the human subject and how you practically carry yourself and how you think? And he's like, oh, by the way, if you look at history, you actually see a movement toward an awareness of a one needing to be open to the many through a movement of the mistakes of one to the mistake of many ones and how that happens. So what does it mean as a subject if you come to realize that that's how you need to carry yourself in the world? Well, then you end up like Nietzsche's child, right? You end up like the determinate being. And that's why I think Dimitri is correct. So what does it mean to be Nietzsche's child? Because basically that's what's going on. And see, generally a way I think about it is conservatives are aware that society requires a signal per se, right? Well, progressives are aware that a signal can be oppressive because you're forced to follow the signal. Well, conservatives are aware if you have too many signals, then it turns into noise and nothing becomes coherent. But then like liberals are like, well, we'd rather risk the noise than have totalitarian oppression, which by the way, going back to the Cold War and you had a signal that seemed to, because like the way World War I unfolded almost felt like you're on a train track and you can't get off of it. It's like this weird way that history unfolds that feels determined. Like once certain events occur, you're like killing each other. It's like you can't escape it. It's like we talked about the Gerardian apocalypse. It's like everyone talks right now about the singular, like the technological future that's coming, like we can't escape it. Right? We're just going to end up in a world where computers replace man. It just feels like rationality and game theory dynamics have to lead you there. And you see, if you're the postmodernist, game theory dynamics feel like they're going to lead you to nuclear war. Well, then it's better to have noise. Let's create so many signals that there are no signals because it's all noise. And then we won't end up inevitably, the open-endedness will save us from the inevitability of a nuclear war. Because again, if it feels like game theory is going to lead you into a nuclear apocalypse, well, then the only answer is an open-endedness that is always open-ended. That's the only way you avoid the apocalypse. That's what they concluded. And in a way, they're absolutely right. Unfortunately, when you have just noise, the average society becomes impossible. People don't know how to relate and they're overwhelmed. And now all the liberals want to kill the conservatives and all the conservatives want to kill the liberals. And under that condition, fascism comes back. The whole totalitarianism comes back, right? So that's not the answer. So what you have to do is have multiple signals or the ability of, while following a single signal, to change signals. Well, that gets into what I talk about, like non-rationality, the ability to follow a rationality and then introduce non-rationality so you move off the track and avoid the apocalypse, right? So there has to be a signal, okay? You can't have just noise because people lose their minds. And they create a signal for themselves, and that tends to be violent and bad. So you have to have a signal, but that signal, to avoid the inevitability of World War III or whatever, has to be able to change its direction. And that's the open to the possibility. But there is a signal. There is a thing. But that then, of course, says, how in the world is that possible? Well, that's the Nietzschean child. There are values for the child. They're not just like an open-ended relativist. They are, in fact, living according to a signal. That's Hegel's determinate being. There is, in fact, a signal, but it's an open signal. And that seems to be like basically the only possibility. That seems to be the name of the game. Now, only possibility, 100 years from now, a new form of onto epistemology may arise. But, right now, that seems to be what needs to go on. And introducing that to the topics of like work, family, gender, occupation, all those different things, is where you start in June, like philosophy change into something about self-forgetting, gender forgetting, timing, phenomenology of the artist, skill, courage, like, the determinate being. That's where all of those shifts seem to occur.
I think, was it recently, he realized that actually him going through the transgender process was a mistake, right? He realized that it seems like he's starting to acknowledge that he was actually just confused.
Sure.
Right.
Sure.
and this is kind of like to your point about like the sort of open-ended or just kind of like full acceptance of just like you have your interpretation and so on. Um, he encountered Reddit. This is stuff that he told me. He encountered Reddit, and then he said, yeah, I think I'm, transgender. But then he comes, several years later, admits to me that he was just confused. That actually, it has to do more like our own family relations and so on. So it seems like modernity or postmodernism seems to just like just let the excess just sort of just run wild and in an open-ended sort of way, whereas conservatism is more just like they just want to contain the excess and just demand it and define it as reality. But again, I think the notion of changing signals makes a lot of sense because it's how we deal with the excess, right? Because
Right.
obviously there's a danger with just a full-blown excess, and I think keeping things open is like just allowing the floodgates to just come in and just take you. I mean, basically it's Noah's Ark, because actually Ibn Arabi, his own interpretation of this is that actually they weren't polytheists. They were just drowning in their own bewilderment of God. They couldn't
Right.
possibly understand God, because it was just such an excess of bewilderment going on.
Right.
And there's reasons why God has to sort of appear in forms or in certain events, is because the excess is too much. It's
Right.
overwhelming.
Right.
It's existentially destroying,
Oh, yeah.
And so, yeah, go ahead, Daniel.
Well, we have to be able to hold in mind, like you mentioned, the transgender. So, for example, I think a very powerful book, Dietrich McCloskey wrote on crossing, of how found out he was transgender and would just cross dress and different things like that. And it was like it was no doubt, right? It's like, but we also have to hold in our minds the thinking one is transgender in response to a situation in their life that is just saying that that's a possible interpretation that is not the correct interpretation. Like right now, we have a way of thinking that is all or nothing, right? Well, we know there are brains that, for example, are in a masculine body, but the brain is feminine. We know this, but that means there's a transgender sex, right? But then there is an interpretation of transgenderism that may or may not align with that sex. And what that means is where the conversation has to take place. But if right now we confuse sex and gender, or say that sex equals gender, either, the conservative will say sex is gender, as if there isn't a division, as if there is no interpretation, which there obviously is. But then there can be a liberal way where sex equals gender in the sense that the interpretation is as valid as the facticity. And so both of them are actually kind of having a one in a sense, right? Where like the thing is the interpretation. And the issue is that although in theory, both of those are internally consistent, the problem that can happen with the conservative is that when sex equals gender, then people can be oppressed by interpretations of gender. But then in the progressive thing, where sex equals gender, where gender is just as good as sex, you can have people that you don't have space for the possibility of responding to a facticity in a manner that leads them to a place where they don't want to be. Right? You have to deny that as a possible event that can occur, because that would like create a lot of complexity. If both sides admitted the potential mistakes of making sex equal gender, well, then there would only be one option. They'd have to be one open to the many. Well, oh my gosh, that's an entirely different way of carrying yourself in the world. And no one, rather conservative, liberal, or us, likes to change how you carry yourself in the world. It is not natural. It is very difficult. You have to work very, very hard. And basically what this is the problem is we will so adamantly resist new forms of subjectivity, because each one of those is a new form of subjectivity, that we basically rather fight, kill, destroy anyone who would dare suggest we need to change forms of subjectivity to have space for both and to have the conversation there. And that's what's happening, is like basically because the transgender topic is exactly right. That forces the question of new forms of subjectivity. And basically both conservatives and liberals, although liberals, both of them actually treat sex as equal to gender.
Yeah, when you read Butler, she says, no, they're not the same. But practically, it is the same. And where conservatives also will kind of deny, they'll kind of act like it is self-evident what gender roles should be based on sex. It's actually not, so they can kind of deny that. But then you also can have a progressive denial that the interpretation of sex does not equal the sex or transform the sex. Because basically what you're kind of saying is like, well, my interpretation of my sex has just as much impact on how I unfold as does the facticity of my sex. That doesn't seem to be the case, because literally brains are wired according to sex. That's actually why the transgender exists, right? It's possible to have a brain that is wired feminine while having male genitalia. That's why the very problem exists, right? So you have to, both sides right now actually operate as if sex equals gender, which just is a form of the one. And to escape that, there has to be an openness to the many, and the conversation has to occur there. But what is that? That's a change in subjectivity, and we do not like that. We will fight tooth and nail against that.
Yeah. And, just kind of like, he was like, he came to certain facts of the facticity of it. He's like, yeah, I wanted to be a woman. And then, I realized that, like, how is that possible, in the sense that, one, I will never be able to give birth, right? He sort of understood like this essential factor of like what he interpreted as being a woman, like, giving birth is something that is sort of like a part of like, what we interpret as being a woman, or the potential to, give birth, that would be perhaps a more correct statement. But he realized this, and he realized other things, but there seems to be, again, this obsession where we're super cognizant of identity, where he drove himself a little mad about constantly trying to look and be a woman, right? This sort of, just pathological, just, cycle of just like, I am not woman enough. I am not looking like a woman. I am not feel like a woman. And then, he starts coming across this more existential crisis, like maybe I'll never be a woman, and it's all this stuff like that. But the thing is, we do this with ourselves.
Yes.
Even just by being a man, like I could just drive myself crazy. Like, what does it mean to be a man? I don't know. And I start asking so many people around, and I'm like, okay. And at the end of the day, you're not really going to get a definitive answer, because everybody has a different grasp of what does it mean to be a man.
I'm so glad you brought this up. I don't mean to interrupt. I'm so glad you brought this up, because a key component of when I'm talking about gender forgetfulness is that if you don't have gender forgetfulness, you're stuck in a self-relating negativity. Like, it's always relating to the self, and it's a negativity, so it can never answer. So the only answer is forgetting about it. And you do that by looking outward. Like, you looking outward from a self-relating negativity to the other. And then, like, when you can treat the other and you don't break like that doorknob, you forget about yourself. It's because when you fail, then you reflect on yourself, and then you enter the self-relating negativity again. So that's exactly right. Like, if you try to define masculinity to yourself, you're doomed, because you can always be stronger. You can always do something different. It's a self-relating negativity. And since we are fundamentally constituted by a lack, in that sense, when the lack relates to itself, then it remembers the lack and it self-relates and it goes toward hell, as basically Trey Telesbaum talks about. Whereas when the lack looks out, it is virtually not a lack, even if it is, when it looks at itself, a lack, because it's not looking at itself. It's like not looking at Lot's wife. You're looking outward at the other, and you're just flowing in the otherness. You forget your gender, you forget yourself. And if you don't do that, you have self-remembering, you have self-relating negativity. Both conservatism and liberalism in America make you end up in a self-relating negativity. Both of them do, because if the conservative is like, you need an identity, you try to make one and you self-relate into nothing. If the liberal is like, you need to make your identity for yourself and create it for yourself, well, you're still relating to yourself in a self-relating negativity. So both of them end up in hell, basically. The only way to escape that is a kind of self-forgetting, gender forgetting, work forgetting, dating forgetting, a kind of excess where you forget about it and you just look outward.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. Because even the construction of your own identity, right, is that, ironically, the liberals try to get that affirmation from the outside, right? But the funny thing is, the problem is they'll never get that affirmation from the outside, because, like, the conservative point is that you can never dictate to somebody what you demand to be called. And ironically, because of this, they keep catching themselves in the relating negativity, because they're like, well, you need to call me by this so I can be this.
Yes.
Right. But there's never like a sense of forgetfulness where it's like, I think it's possible for the liberal to, sort of be like, hey, my name is, they, them, whatever.
Sure.
But if somebody doesn't address them by that, they do a self-forgetting moment where it's like, okay,
Yes.
like I know
Yes.
what I am because of my interpretation, but I leave my interpretation weak to my own folly, meaning like there's going to be people that don't address you as such.
Yes.
Because that's what happens. I mean, some people won't, some people can't, some people also forget, ironically. Right?
Yes.
So, yeah, I think that self-relating negativity is exactly what happens. And the same thing occurs with the idea or the obsession with finding oneself.
Yes.
That, I mean, I encountered that myself in the most dramatic way with Carl Jung. And I think, some of my reservations about psychoanalysis is that lately there is exactly this, right? This obsession about trying to understand gender difference, sexual difference, right? But the problem is that, like, just like Chachan said at one time, one of your net sessions, he said, the promotion of the question is also the very thing that sustains the problem.
Exactly.
Right. And that itself becomes pathological.
Yes.
Right. What is gender difference? What is this? What is this? I mean, the constant asking of this, it is necessary, but at the same time, it gets to ask the question, when does it become pathological to keep promoting this question?
Yes.
Yes, well, and it's an entirely different discussion, because the next stage of this is, what is the government, political, and economic policy of which is going to promote self-forgetfulness? And that, but that is, you finally have a rubric, because right now we're trying to design economics, politics, social organizations, higher, social, all these structures. We're trying to create them in terms of a one, rather it be it's still in a self-relating negativity, because like when you have the progressive notion, for example, of I should be referred to as a they, other people should, even, and if they forget, you get upset and you're like, well, you should refer to me as a they. The issue is, if you're self-relating negativity, there actually is no they to relate to. It's not there, right? And so you're asking people to affirm something that's not there in yourself. It's there in the doing of it. It's there in the forgetting of it, right? And so the very moment you remember, hey, you ought to call me by it vanishes in a funny way. Like the very calling attention to it makes it go. It's not there anymore. And there are plenty of mythological stories that have this structure, right? In the same way that when conservatives are like, we need to make America great again and get back to the great America, it's gone. It's not there. America ceases to be great precisely when you hold it up as a kind of ideal, right? Because then it becomes a self-relating negativity. Both conservatives and liberals are making mistakes that are drawing attention into a self-relating negativity, and it creates a hell. Following Trey, right? It becomes a pathological, self-effacing self-destruction. Whereas forgetting, which is outward, which is self-consciousness moving into reason, what I call the absolute choice, that is a negation, right? So you get that negation that progressives want, but it is a negation that sublimates in the forgetting, in the openness to the other. Right. So that, so much of the emphasis on, say, progressives will emphasize diversity and other people and being open to difference. Conservatives will emphasize family and community and being open to other people. So both of them have this kind of emphasis on a certain caring about community. But since both of them are operating within a self-relating negativity, both of those ultimately become pathological. You have to forget and look out, and then learn the timing and the arts and the skills to keep your looking and gaze outward. And that gets into, for me, that gets into thinking about the Trinity and different things, because, each person of the Trinity is perpetually open to the other. And, the Holy Spirit doesn't think about the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit thinks about the Son and the Father and is completely lost in the other person. And you have, one essence with multiple persons, right? They all have the same essence, but there are different people in different things like that. Well, that seems to be the kind of the name of the game. How do we, it is only in a kind of self-forgetfulness
that you can have a shared essence of multiple people. The essence is the forgetting, and the essence vanishes the moment you look at it. The moment you draw attention to it, it's gone. But when you have that kind of self-forgetfulness that I think defines the Trinity, which you could also call a communal ontology, that's actually when you get a shared essence. But when you look at the shared essence, it's gone. It goes into the self-relating negativity. It's kind of like we talked about that tree of knowledge you don't eat from. You keep the door locked, in that next session, right? The Mariana different thing. You have to leave it alone. Both conservatives and liberals in different ways fail to leave it alone. And the reason this is so terrible is because then you're trapped. This is where we need more Derrida. You're trapped in a dichotomy. Well, if the conservatives suck, then the liberals will save us. Well, if the liberals suck, then the conservatives will save us. Nah, man, those are still just two different ways to end up in self-relating negativity. And so we're trapped between those, where if you truly introduce deconstruction and you got rid of both of those and you start talking about a one open to the many, which theology is in a much more natural position to do than philosophy. So theology doesn't have a problem with deconstructing that, like that level of extreme deconstruction. Whereas society, politics, economics, and philosophy struggle with it because it feels like there's nothing. Exactly. We need to, there's a kind of the nothing of forgetting, of which then actually creates the shared essence. The letting of the letting be, as Thomas Wynne will say. So both of them right now, by not having that category of self-forgetting, you're just ending in infinite self-relating negativity.
Yeah, it seems like, because I think Caputo mentions this a little bit in Prayers and Tears of Jacques Derrida, where he talks about a generalized apophatics. Like he's trying to advocate for more generalized apophatics. And it reminded me exactly about the way you framed it, right? Like the moment we say it,
it's gone.
It's gone, yeah. Right? Yeah. And I think this is kind of like what we need more of, like this notion of like a generalized apophatics, because if you think about apophatic theology, they know that whatever they say, it can't possibly even come close to what it is. Right. And so this notion of, saying what I am, and I think this is the part where Derrida can save us. Yes. This notion of hermeneutics and the way we talk. But if we're talking about now placing in laws and thinking about the more social structure, about how do we maintain a sort of apophatic way of speaking and relating to each other in relation to sort of self-forgetting, encountering our own folly. I mean, not even I could think of like possibly what this would look like. I mean, but we're obviously, we're hinting at something important here with, the law as such. And I think it's almost like, it's funny. There's something ironic about apophatics. I think Derrida points this out, Caputo points this out, that in apophatic theology, negative theology, there's like an excess of talking.
Yes.
Right. Yes. And yet at the same time, they know that they're not getting at what they're getting at.
Yes.
It's like, that is absolutely necessary. It seems like in just like our common day discourse, where it's like, yes, I have to respond, so I'm going to respond, but I also know at the same time I'm never going to get at what I'm actually getting at.
Yes.
In this way. But, I think, it has to begin with our personal relations. And I think, it definitely begins with ourselves and the way we talk to people and so on, because I think, ironically enough, the influence of subjective relations is that the moment somebody else sees how the repetitive encounter of an open-ended interpretation or a weak interpretation, you could say, is that eventually something through the course of time changes. Caputo actually made a very wonderful example. It kind of blew my mind because they were really pressing Caputo. I was watching an interview, no, not an interview, but it was like a session, and a lot of the kids kind of like came up with questions, and they were really challenging Caputo as like he doesn't fall into some type of quietism. They were really kind of really attacking him on this. But Caputo actually gave a brilliant answer. He said, if you think about Rosa Parks, right, and how she kind of made that whole event happen, right? But Caputo notes how actually it took so many people before her rejecting, giving up their seats, getting getting beaten up, possibly killed, that it eventually manifested itself in the event of Rosa Parks.
Yes.
Where it became such a historical, thing. But it's exactly that sort of mundane repetition of what we thought was what we should do that eventually culminated in the event of Rosa Parks, and so there is something to be said about that. And I think, if one already starts engaging with a sort of like general apophatics, what ends up happening, I think, through the course of repetition is that eventually someone will initiate the event.
Yes.
It may not be in this time period, it may not be you or me, it may not be anybody else here, but it's the very fact that we decide that this is the right answer. And through repetition, something breaks through. At least we hope it breaks through. It's always a perhaps in this case, relating to Caputo. But yeah, I think, that's like kind of like I think that was the brilliant answer that Caputo gave in that response.
Well, a few things before I sadly must run off. But there's a few things. So, for Hegel, Napoleon didn't have to be Napoleon, but there had to be a Napoleon. Like, that's kind of what Rosa Parks didn't have to be Rosa Parks, but it had to be Rosa Parks. Like, there's this kind of building that then eventually negates. And this is why true infinities are larger than spurious infinities. And a true infinity always entails the repetition and the negation. The spurious infinity is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. A true infinity is 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. And the funny thing is, like, when you keep saying 1 and 1 over again, you realize you never say 1 the same way. And eventually that opens the new thought. It's like, wait a minute, what does it mean that I can never say 1 the same way? Oh, it looks like, there's something bigger going on, right? And so true infinity requires the repetition, of which then unveils that the repetition is not a repetition, but that can only be found in the effort of the repetition. And so likewise, the quietism as such is actually a Heideggerian clearing that makes possible the unveiling of true infinity. It just looks like you're doing nothing, but it's actually a clearing. It has to be the risk of doing nothing. But without that risk, there's no possibility of the clearing that makes new being possibly come forth. The last thing I'll say is basically what we're saying is that we need to think in terms of a society of self-forgetting. Whereas right now, society and politics and everything is in the business of acknowledgement. Like, Christians want to be acknowledged. This is a Christian nation and we need to get America back to its Christian roots, and we need to acknowledge our real history. And there's like a real emphasis on acknowledgement. Liberals, there's an emphasis on acknowledgement. It's like, we want to be acknowledged in our variation on gender. We want to be acknowledged in terms of race. We want to be acknowledged as minorities. Now, there's a sense in which acknowledgement is extremely important, because if you're literally like, if you mean like right now we're acknowledged in a manner that makes us less than human and we're put in internment camps or something like that. Well, what you mean when you say we want to be acknowledged is that we don't want to be mistreated. By all means, you need to have a society that is not in the business of mistreating its people. But you see, that easily bleeds over where people say we're mistreated if we're not acknowledged. And there's a line that is crossed there. And when that line is crossed, rather by conservatives or liberals, you're now in the realm of self-relating negativity. And that actually means you're in hell, right? And so so if society designs itself in business of the point, if you think the point of society is for acknowledgement, then the way you do politics, economics, organization, everything changes. But if instead you say, no, the point of society is to create the conditions of self-forgetfulness, which means that people are free to be themselves to an excess to the point where they don't have to think about themselves. Well, that changes things, right? You might ask instead of the question. So, for example, you might say, well, maybe instead of government spreading, say, marriage to, say, homosexual side people, all these different people, maybe government shouldn't be in the business of marriage at all, because that would help the society forget about marriage and the feeling that they need to have themselves acknowledged by the government, right? Because a lot of this problem emerges indeed when the government gets into the business of doing different things, because then the government picks winners and losers. Like, why are so many small businesses pissed off? Because they feel like the government only acknowledges Wall Street. They don't acknowledge small business. So maybe if the government didn't use the tax code as a indirect form of legislation, everyone could engage in, you could have more business forgetfulness, right? So when the government picks winners and losers, rather it be in terms of who gets married, who doesn't, which businesses get the tax write-off, who doesn't, then that's all forms of acknowledgement. Now, at the same time, if you don't have a government at all, well, then you can't defend yourself, and you don't have a military, you could be invaded by foreign powers, you don't have a currency system, and that's actually going to result in self-relating negativity, because you're constantly going to be thinking about how you're unable to say convince people to give you a haircut because you can't barter something with them that they want, right? Or you're always nervous about invasion because you don't have enough of a centralization to defend against foreign invasion, or you don't have enough society to band together to help things from falling apart into like a story out of Icelandic literature where the neighbors or Hobbes or something is killing one another. So you can't have no government, but you also can't have government that is overly in the business of acknowledgement, because that creates self-relating negativity. That's an entirely, if that's your rubric, you now have a different rubric to think about policy, right? You now have a different heuristic by which to go economic issue by economic issue by economic issue, right? And so that, to me, is really important. In the same way that if your heuristic becomes self-forgetting, you have a different way to think about yourself using your time and what you focus on getting good at and what you emphasize, right? Because you want to reach a place of self-forgetting, not where you're constantly acknowledging yourself as a real man or a smart person or a capable worker. Looks like you were doing those things to acknowledge yourself. Now you're in a self-relating negativity, right? So you have an entirely different heuristic by which to think about how you carry yourself in the world. And that would have, I think, implications on the political and so. But if you have any last things to say, please, Javier.
The government, I mean, I almost feel like actually, if you do shift deconstruction instead of from the people to the government, and actually I think that would help. In terms of what something Caputo calls armed neutrality. I actually really like this term, armed neutrality, because it would mean that actually the government, we don't make the government too strong, but then we don't just eradicate, have no government. But this idea of armed neutrality, meaning like the government plays the role of, actually, they should play the role of perhaps. That they're the ones that say, yeah, perhaps, to the people.
Yes.
Right? So that way it's like nobody wins. No human being gets the notion of winner or losers, but the government goes, yeah, perhaps. Yes, right? Yes. To keep it open-ended while the people have to decide.
I am a big fan of the notion of applying deconstruction more so to politics than to individuals. I think that is exactly right. The government should primarily be in the business of perhaps. And that changes how it carries itself. I think you're exactly right.
Yeah, I think because I got this idea only suddenly, but just because I was like thinking like, deconstruction did so well, in my opinion, for theology. It really started shifting the thinking going on. But deconstruction in terms of just like individuals and just the many, it does seem a little too chaotic. But in terms of actual structures, government, the church, theology, deconstruction seems to really have a benefit. It can be beneficial.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
So. Well, the last thing I'll say is, someone, if you read the Federalist paper and the kind of the idea of the breakdown of the states in America between the central government, there's this kind of blend of like not too strong, not too big, or different things like that. And a lot of conservatives and libertarians will argue that the government has become too big and that it doesn't have that balance of powers and different things. And there is a sense in which the ideal of the federalist system is a kind of deconstructional perhaps, right? Now, the issue is it's not always easy to tell what exactly creates the perhaps, or you're so uncentralized, like the whole reason, the whole reason the Constitution was written, a lot of conservatives will argue there's like small government in the Constitution, but you always have to remember the Constitution is written because the Articles of Confederation didn't work. They weren't centralized enough. And so like the main drive of the Constitution was actually to centralize, but not to centralize so much that it then crushed the openness to the other, right? So it is not always easy to tell what that balance is. But let me tell you this, it especially will not be easy if the average person in your democratic republic does not have the heuristic of self-forgetfulness. Like, if everyone in your society, and this of course is an ideal, right? But it's just a thought. Like, if everyone in your society understood that the goal was self-forgetfulness as opposed to acknowledgement, that would change how people voted. That would change how people thought the government should act. And again, self-forgetfulness is not merely anarchism, because if, for example, minorities are being turned into slaves in the South, they are forced to relate to themselves as minority precisely because of the oppression, right? Like, you cannot, as a government, allow that kind of oppression precisely because it forces minorities to relate to themselves as minorities and thus submits them by external forces to a self-relating negativity. You see, to me, self-forgetting is what the main point I'm trying to get at is that a lot of conservatives will talk about states' rights. They'll say that rights ought to have states and different things. The problem with that is I don't think that's good enough of a heuristic, because it assumes that smaller creates the conditions of individual liberty more so, right? That is not necessarily the case if a state is turning minorities into slaves, right? But if instead of talking about states' rights, you talk about the conditions of self-forgetfulness, that becomes a heuristic where you say, well, if there's slavery, minorities can't forget themselves and relate communally with the rest of the society. So the government needs to step in and remove that. But after it removes that, it needs to leave the state alone so that the state can engage in a self-forgetfulness, right? So that's, to me, the heuristic of self-forgetfulness becomes more nuanced where you don't just have a banner of states' rights, or you don't just have a banner, and I'm obviously talking about America, but I believe the thought applies just as well to any nation. I'm in Virginia. But then you also don't have this banner of states are evil. Like, that's basically what progressives see. Like, the moment you talk about states' rights, you're talking about some sort of oppression. Don't get me wrong. Conservatives very often will use the banner of states' rights to justify doing something they shouldn't do. But then at the same time, you will have progressives that act like the government can do no wrong. Right? Like they're putting forth a policy, and as if federal policy was not prone to unintended consequences. Like, the bigger the system, the higher the likelihood of unintended consequences, right? And so that's a reality. So how do you navigate both of those? Well, the language of unity, the union, won't get you there, but the language of states' rights won't get you there either. You have to think in terms of the goal of the state or the society is to create the conditions of self-forgetfulness so that you avoid a self-relating negativity. And that transforms, I think that becomes the right heuristic, where you're applying deconstruction, but you're doing it in service of a one that is open to the many, as opposed to a something that's more problematic.
No, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think if we have a government that's sort of like an armed neutrality in terms of keeping open an aspect of self-forgetfulness, then that would probably be the correct answer to that. Now, of course, how that manifests, I have no idea.
Well, you have to go issue by issue. I mean, that's the issue, right?
Exactly.
Like, there's no way to avoid this. Like, so, for example, what is, you could talk about transsexuals in the military, right? You could say, oh, well, no one should be a transsexual in the military. Well, that could call self-relating negativity, because everyone's like, we're not transsexual, so we relate to ourselves not a transsexual. But then there's also a gender acknowledgement that could occur that creates self-relating negativity. So what exactly does that look like? You'd have to go through. Likewise, if you destroy Wall Street because you're like, oh, Wall Street is evil and it destroys small business, well, now all the small businesses can't get liquidity. They relate to themselves as a small business that is becoming smaller, and they deconstruct themselves, right? Like this, you have to go issue by issue. There's no way to avoid that. And we've wanted to avoid that, right? And both conservatives and liberals have kind of wanted to avoid that, where you just say, let's go back to how the founders intended America. Well, then we don't have to deal with difference. We just got to interpret what we think the founders intended and go back to that, and then we're done. Or you just say whatever people interpret is the way to go, and we just should respect that. It's like, well, then you don't have any social signaling, and everything deconstructs into chaos, and then you don't even have an us to unify. That's the issue, right? If there's no signaling, there's no us. So you can't talk about acceptance because there's no us. There's not enough of a relation to even accept one another, right? But if you make everyone kind of reflect the original intention, there's no us either. There's just me who's embodied in other people that I force to be like me, right? But so you have to go issue by issue by issue by issue. And then I mentioned this to Dawood in a recent talk, is Substantive democracy, as someone like James Hunter talks about, which I think is very useful, is where everyone brings to the table their unique perspective on what the breakdown of the proportions look like between those positions. And maybe you say, well, like I'm just making numbers here. I say, well, on this issue, the answer is 70% conservative, 30% liberal. And on this issue, it's 40% liberal. No, it's like 60% liberal and 40% conservative or what. I'm just making numbers up. And everyone doesn't think it's just liberal or just conservative. They think it's some sort of breakdown of proportion between the different sides. And then the debate becomes not between liberal and conservative. It becomes about the breakdown of the proportions. That completely transforms the democratic discussion, because we're not arguing either for liberal or conservative. We're arguing for the proportionate breakdown of those positions on a given issue between those. And that's when you can then have the collective consciousness arise, say, for example, on the breakdown, say, in gender in the military, the involvement of Wall Street, liquidity, the Federal Reserve. You can have a breakdown between those things on each of those issues as arrived at by the collective consciousness. But the likelihood of the collective consciousness effectively coming up with solutions is incredibly low, because I think ultimately it has to kind of be that, because if Lorenzo is correct that collective consciousness is more effective if you have neurodivergency involved. Neurodivergency increases the effectiveness of collective consciousness, and collective consciousness tends to be more effective than individual consciousness. Well, here's the thing. If everyone is either a one in conservative or many ones in liberal, that's not neurodivergence. They're actually both following a one. So you don't have neurodivergence. The only way to get neurodivergence per se is to have a one open to the many that we've been saying. Now you have, if everyone thinks that way, now we have neurodivergence. Now in the democratic system, we have a collective consciousness. And now we have reason to think that the breakdown between the two ideological systems has a much higher probability of being a good breakdown, or a breakdown that the society can live with, so that we can continue to signal to one another to create a society possible without othering and demonizing the other person. So you bring these things together, a neurodivergent collective democracy that thinks in terms of proportions, not either or, and then you now have the computing, almost the algorithm, if you will, the organic algorithm to increase the probability that each one of those issues is addressed in a manner that avoids self-relating negativity in favor of self-forgetfulness, of which then means communal ontology, defining ourselves in the becoming other, the reason in Hegel, of which at the end of the day, if a nation is to be a nation, it has to be that. There is no nation if there is not a communal ontology.
And one last thing, because you gave me this idea actually right now, is that actually if parties would just have some type of neurodivergency within themselves, right? Like if there was some type of deconstruction happening within the parties themselves, manifesting as people, right? So, we need more Democrats disagreeing with other Democrats, saying like, actually, maybe perhaps that is not the case, and the same thing with, we need more conservatives disagreeing with conservatives about, yeah, maybe perhaps, but we don't really know. Like, this is why I like Zizek and his kind of stances with this. Is kind of like, he's the one figure that is very controversial to liberals.
Yes, absolutely.
Like that is why Zizek is so attractive, in my opinion. But we need more figures like that, where you become a part of a party as a sort of, but in a moment of self-forgetfulness, you actually challenge the party itself while in the party,
That's right.
Because nobody's going to listen to each other knowing that they are the other side. We already know that's what's not going to happen. But if there is more people within the party that are deconstructive, then we have a chance of opening up something. And so I agree with you in that case.
No, I'm glad you said that, because I think it is awful where there's kind of an idea of, oh, you have fracturing inside of the Democratic Party or fracturing inside of the Republican Party. Yeah, that might be bad for winning elections, but it's actually good for thinking. And you see that now that's going to get into the subject of how we do elections and how we determine winners and different things. But unfortunately, there is a way where that algorithm, as I called it, that the current electoral system may get in the way of the implementation of a more effective algorithm for determining self-forgetfulness on given issues. And so that's where then party unity becomes a big deal, because you don't want to break down the vote. And that would get us into the electoral college. That would get us into a bunch of different things. But I think but you see right there, like, you're now talking about something. There is reason to think that the electoral process needs to be changed because of a new heuristic. You see, like, the different heuristic then guide you. It does have practical implications. Like, the heuristic that you choose to operate according to transforms what you think you need to think about. So it is practical. Ideas always have consequences. And so I think what you're saying is exactly right. And once you get like Democrats that all have to think like Democrats, that's where extremism comes from. Duh. I mean, that's where tribalism, conservatism, that's where, like, at the, Jonathan Rauch talks about this. It used to be when you went to the congressional, they have a cafeteria, and it would be full of Republicans and Democrats talking, they'd be eating. Nobody goes there anymore. Nobody goes there. That cafeteria is like basically always empty, except for like, clerks or interns or different things like that. So, that cafeteria is a great symbol of where, efforts for unity lead you. Emptiness. You get an empty room when everyone's unified. That's what ends up happening. But anyway, Javier, I've enjoyed this very much. This was delightful. Thank you for our Black Friday special. I've enjoyed that. And I've really enjoyed it. So thank you so much, Javier. I appreciate it. Sir.
Same here.